The Pacific Theater in 1943 was a world of fire, mud, and relentless heat. The jungles of Guadalcanal, the coral sands of Tarawa, and the volcanic rock of Saipan had become battlefields unlike any other. American forces were learning, island by island, that the Japanese army fought not just with weapons, but with an unbreakable spirit. Yet soon, a new presence would roll into those jungles, one that would shake the balance of power: the M4 Sherman tank. The early days of jungle warfare. For months, American infantry had fought without heavy armor. The terrain was too rough, too wet, too choked by vegetation. Japanese soldiers had dug in deep, creating fortified tunnels, bunkers, and camouflaged positions invisible to the naked eye. Battles were fought at close range: bayonets, grenades, and flamethrowers. But the Marines needed more. They needed a weapon that could crush fortifications, destroy machine gun nests, and give them cover in the open. That's when the call came: send in the Shermans. The first landings. On a humid morning in late 1943, the sound of tread cats echoed across a small beach on Bougainville. American Marines watched in awe as steel monsters rolled off landing craft, water streaming from their armored hulls. The M4 Shermans gleamed under the Pacific sun, olive-drab giants that dwarfed anything the Japanese had fielded. Sergeant Bill Connor leaned against his rifle and smirked. "Look at that, boys. That thing's gonna scare the hell out of them." Corporal Davis nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Let's just hope it doesn't sink before it gets to the jungle." The tanks roared forward, treads grinding into wet sand, their 75mm cannons facing inland. The Japanese defenders, hidden among the trees, watched through binoculars. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen such a machine. The Japanese reaction. Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato of the Imperial Japanese Army gripped his field glasses tightly. His men were dug in: light artillery, anti-tank rifles, and a few Type 97 tanks that already struggled in the rough terrain. When he saw the Shermans coming, his heart sank. These are not like the British tanks. They are bigger, heavier." The adjutant frowned. "Can our guns stop them?" Sato's silence was the answer. Moments later, the first Sherman fired, a thunderous crack that echoed through the jungle. A Japanese bunker exploded in flames and debris. The soldiers who survived looked on in disbelief. No shell they fired could penetrate its thick frontal armor. The Sherman kept coming, relentless, unstoppable, like a beast of iron. The Marines advance. The infantry followed closely behind the tanks, using them as moving shields. When the Japanese tried to flank, the Shermans turned, crushing trees and undergrowth, mowing down ambushes with coaxial machine guns. The roar of their engines drowned out the jungle's sounds. Private Allen, one of the youngest Marines, later wrote in his diary, "The Japs thought the jungle was theirs, but when the tanks came, everything changed. You could see the fear in their eyes. They shot, they ran, but those tanks just kept rolling. It was like watching the earth itself come alive." The myth of invincibility breaks. For the Japanese, the Sherman was more than a weapon. It was a psychological blow. Their tactics of stealth and surprise suddenly seemed powerless. Grenades and Molotovs bounced off the tank's hull. Even suicide charges failed to stop them. Captain Sato ordered his men to fall back deeper into the jungle, where the terrain was too rough for tanks to follow. But even there, the sound of the Sherman's engine haunted them, a reminder that the Americans now had something beyond courage. They had dominance. The aftermath. By nightfall, the Marines had secured the beachhead. Dozens of bunkers were flattened, and the Sherman crews rested beside their tanks, their faces blackened with smoke and sweat. For the first time in months, the Marines felt untouchable. And somewhere in the darkness of the jungle, Japanese soldiers whispered stories of the steel beasts that no bullet could kill. a new terror of war that would soon roll across every island of the Pacific. The sun rose slowly over the island, painting the thick jungle canopy in shades of gold and green. The air was heavy with humidity and the lingering stench of gunpowder. Beneath the dense palms, American Marines and their newly arrived Shermans prepared to push inland. The night had been restless, sporadic sniper fire, distant explosions, and the ever-present drone of insects. The men were exhausted, but the tanks stood ready, massive, confident, and humming with power. To the Marines, they were salvation. To the Japanese, they were a nightmare made real. The march into the green hell. The order came at dawn: advance to Hill 65, clear the jungle, eliminate resistance. 3 Sherman tanks led the way, their treads crushing roots, trees, and mud as if the jungle itself were nothing. Infantry squads followed closely, wary of mines and ambushes. The sound of engines reverberated through the trees, a deep metallic growl that sent flocks of birds scattering into the humid sky. Inside the lead tank, Sergeant Bill Connor gripped the turret handles. Sweat dripped down his neck despite the open hatch. "Visibility's crap. Feels like driving through a damn oven full of leaves." From below, his driver responded, "Ain't the leaves I'm worried about, Sarge. It's what's hiding behind 'em." Every shadow could be an enemy. Every rustle could be a grenade. The Sherman, though powerful, was not invincible in the jungle. Its thick armor was both a blessing and a curse. Protection, but also a trap if immobilized. They reached a narrow clearing. Silence. Only the hum of engines. Then, without warning, the jungle exploded in sound. Japanese soldiers opened fire from hidden trenches and camouflaged bunkers. Mortar shells whistled overhead, and bursts of machine gun fire tore through the leaves. The Marines hit the ground, returning fire. The Sherman swung their turrets toward the flashes of muzzle fire. "Target! Bunker at 2 o'clock!" Connor barked. The gunner adjusted, his voice steady despite the chaos. "On it, Sarge!" A thunderous boom followed. The 75mm shell slammed into the bunker, sending dirt, wood, and limbs flying into the air. The jungle shook as the Sherman fired again and again, the concussive blasts echoing for miles. But the Japanese were relentless. They darted between trees, tossing grenades, some even rushing the tanks with satchel charges. One soldier, his uniform torn and muddy, sprinted forward, screaming, "Tenno Heike Banzai!" which means, "Long live the Emperor." He leapt toward the tank, explosives clutched in his hands. The explosion rocked the Sherman, smoke and dirt engulfing it. For a moment, the Marines feared the worst, but as the dust cleared, the tank still stood, scorched but alive. Its turret slowly turned, the cannon roaring back in reply. From a nearby ridge, Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato watched the battle unfold through trembling hands. His anti-tank team had fired several shells, but the rounds bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's armor. "They do not stop," muttered one of his men. "Our bullets are useless." Sato's jaw tightened. "Then we fight with courage. We fight with honor." He gave the order for a counterattack. Dozens of soldiers emerged from the brush, shouting battle cries, charging toward the steel beasts that dominated the clearing. The Americans answered with machine gun fire and high explosive shells. The clash was brutal, men against machines. The jungle floor ran red with blood. And yet, even in their courage, the Japanese soldiers realized the truth. This was a war they could not win by willpower alone. The turning point. Hours later, the battle subsided. Smoke hung low over the jungle. The Sherman tanks stood amid the wreckage, their armor pocked with shrapnel, their paint scorched, but their engines still rumbling. Around them lay the shattered remains of bunkers, guns, and broken trees. The Marines gathered near the lead tank, sharing canteens of warm water, their faces grim. Private Allen looked at the wrecked enemy positions and whispered, "I've never seen anything like it. They threw everything at us, and it didn't even scratch the paint." Sergeant Connor lit a cigarette, eyes scanning the tree line. "Don't get cocky, kid. The jungle still wants to kill us, and so do they. But yeah," he exhaled a plume of smoke, "this tank's the best damn friend we've got."
Aftermath. As night fell, the Marines fortified their position. Somewhere deep in the forest, survivors of Chateau's unit retreated, carrying the wounded and whispering of the iron monsters that no weapon could destroy. For them, the Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a symbol of American inevitability, a force that could not be stopped by courage or faith or sacrifice. And for the American troops, it was proof that technology, persistence, and teamwork could conquer even the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The Pacific jungle was still hell, but now, hell had an engine.
The night was thick and alive with whispers. The jungle, drenched in mist and blood, seemed to breathe with the rhythm of war. Crickets chirped nervously between distant echoes of artillery. Beneath the shattered trees, the American Marines fortified their new positions around the Shermans, their silhouettes lit by the faint orange glow of smoldering fires. But deep within the shadows, Japanese soldiers watched, waiting. They had seen the Shermans in action. They had witnessed shells bounce off its hull and bullets shatter against its steel skin. They called it Tetsu no Oni, the Iron Demon, and tonight they vowed to destroy it. The calm before the storm. Inside the lead tank, Sergeant Bill Connor sat half asleep, helmet tipped forward, listening to the faint hum of the engine. The smell of oil and smoke lingered. His radio crackled with faint chatter, static mixed with exhaustion. Private Jenkins, the gunner, whispered, "Feels too quiet, Sarge." Connor opened one eye. "That's 'cause it is. Quiet in this jungle means they're planning something." Outside, the Marines kept watch. The jungle was dark, almost unnaturally so. The moon barely penetrated the canopy, and the fog turned every tree into a ghostly figure. Somewhere out there, beyond the perimeter, the enemy moved. The counterattack begins. It started with a single cry, "Banzai!" Loud, fierce, echoing through the trees, then another and another. Suddenly, the jungle erupted. Dozens of Japanese soldiers charged from the darkness, their bayonets glinting, their shouts piercing the night. Behind them, mortars began to fall, explosions lighting up the trees like lightning. The Americans opened fire immediately, machine guns rattling, tracers slicing through the mist. The Shermans roared to life, their engines growling as turrets turned toward the flashes of muzzle fire. "Light 'em up!" Connor yelled. The tank's cannon fired, a thunderclap that shattered the jungle silence. A fireball engulfed a group of attackers, but the rest kept coming, screaming, running through smoke and gunfire like men possessed. Inside the Sherman, the crew worked frantically, loading, aiming, firing. Each shell sent shockwaves through the tank, echoing in their bones. The jungle floor was chaos, flashes of light, bodies falling, explosions shaking the ground. Desperation tactics. Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato stood among his men, shouting orders as they tried to flank the American lines. His plan was simple, deadly, but simple. They would sacrifice everything to destroy the iron monsters. "Hit the treads! Get underneath them!" he ordered. "If one man fails, another will succeed." Small teams, armed with explosives, crawled through the mud, approaching the Shermans like hunters stalking prey. Some carried satchel charges, others had magnetic mines clinging to their chests like grim talismans. One soldier, barely 20, whispered a prayer before sprinting through machine gun fire. He leapt onto a Sherman's side, slamming his explosive against the hull, but a burst from a Marine's bar rifle struck him mid-motion. The explosion went off early, blowing the soldier apart, leaving the tank scarred, but still alive. Connor winced at the impact. "They're trying to crawl right up our damn sides! Keep that turret moving, Jenkins!" The gunner swung the barrel left, firing point blank into a wave of attackers. Trees splintered, the ground shook, the air filled with smoke and screams. Fear and fury. For hours, the battle raged. The Japanese attacked in waves, not because they thought they could win, but because surrender was unthinkable. The Sherman crews fought with grim determination, each explosion rattling their steel fortress. Private Allen, crouched behind a log near the tanks, shouted over the roar of battle, "They just keep coming!" Corporal Davis reloaded, sweat dripping into his eyes. "Then we keep shooting." At dawn, the jungle was littered with bodies. Smoke drifted through the shattered trees. The cries of the wounded echoed in the distance. The ground was scorched and broken. The Shermans still stood, battered, dented, but unbroken. The iron monsters had survived. Aftermath. As the sun rose, the surviving Japanese retreated deeper into the jungle. Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato, his uniform torn and stained with blood, looked back at the battlefield. Around him lay the bodies of his men, brave, devoted, and utterly destroyed. He whispered softly, "We cannot fight machines with spirit alone." Back at the American camp, Sergeant Connor climbed out of his tank, wiping soot from his face. He watched the smoke rise through the trees, his expression hard but thoughtful. They fought like devils, but even the devil can't stop steel. The battle had shown both sides a brutal truth. The age of honor and sword was dying, replaced by the age of iron and fire. And the Sherman tank, unstoppable and merciless, was its herald.
The rain never stopped. For days it poured without mercy, turning the hills of Okinawa into a sea of mud and blood. The ground swallowed men and machines alike. The air stank of rot, oil, and cordite. Every inch of earth was contested, every ridge and cave defended with the fury of the doomed. From the command post, the island looked like the end of the world. In the distance, the Shermans crawled through the sludge, massive, slow, unstoppable beasts covered in grime and scars. Their engines howled against the sucking mud, tracks grinding endlessly forward. Inside one of them, Sergeant Bill Connor wiped condensation from the periscope and muttered, "Hell's got better weather than this place." Private Jenkins gave a dry laugh. "If this is victory, I'd hate to see defeat." The mud and the madness. Okinawa was unlike anything they'd faced before. Every hill was fortified, every cave a death trap. The Japanese defenders didn't retreat, they waited. Hidden in tunnels, bunkers, and spider holes, they let the Americans come close before unleashing hell. The Shermans rolled forward, flanked by infantry slogging through the muck. Mortars fell constantly. Snipers picked off men from unseen ridges. The rain made aiming almost impossible. Visibility was a gray blur of smoke and water. "Up ahead! Pillbox!" Jenkins shouted. Connor turned the turret, aimed through the haze, and fired. The cannon's thunder shook the tank. The concrete bunker vanished in the spray of debris. But another opened fire immediately, a well-camouflaged 47mm anti-tank gun. The shell slammed into the Sherman's side, denting but not piercing. Inside, the crew flinched as sparks rained down. "She's holding," yelled Jenkins. Connor gritted his teeth. "She'd better, 'cause we're not backing up." They fired again and again until the gun went silent. Then they kept moving. There was no other choice. The kamikaze fury. As the Shermans pushed inland, a new kind of terror descended from the sky. At dusk, the sound came, the high-pitched scream of aircraft diving. "Air raid! Air raid!" someone shouted over the radio. Japanese kamikaze planes swooped down in waves, crashing into ships, artillery, and tanks. The horizon lit up in orange fireballs. From the ridge, Connor watched a nearby Sherman take a direct hit. The explosion threw its turret 10 meters into the air. "Jesus," whispered Jenkins. Connor's jaw tightened. "Keep your head down. Those bastards aren't stopping." The kamikazes didn't just attack by air.
On the ground, Japanese soldiers carried satchel charges, crawling through mud and gunfire to blow themselves against tank hulls. Each explosion shook the island. "Why won't they quit?" Jenkins shouted. Connor replied quietly, "Because they've got nowhere left to go." The civilians' tragedy. Days turned into weeks. The Marines fought through villages reduced to ash. And for the first time, the horror of war revealed something deeper. Civilians trapped between two armies. Connor Sherman rolled past a cave where dozens of Okinawan civilians hid. Mothers clutching children, old men praying in silence. Some refused to leave, terrified of what the Americans might do. A young interpreter tried to speak to them. "They think surrender is dishonor," he said sadly. "They were told you'll kill them." Connor removed his helmet, rain streaming down his face. "Tell them we're not the enemy anymore," he said softly. "Tell them it's over." But it wasn't. Not yet. The final Japanese stand. By late June, the Japanese lines had crumbled, but their spirit hadn't. In the southern hills, the last remnants of the Imperial Army prepared for their final stand. Among them was Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato, the same man who had once faced the Shermans on Saipan. He stood beneath the blackened sky, watching his few remaining soldiers dig trenches in the mud. Their uniforms were tattered, their faces hollow, yet their eyes still burned with conviction. "We fight to the last man," Sato said quietly. One soldier nodded. "And then, sir?" Sato smiled faintly. "Then we become ghosts." When dawn came, they attacked. A final, furious charge through the rain, screaming, firing, falling. The Shermans fired back, their cannons thundering, their tracks crushing through the last defense. Connor's tank rolled over the ridge, firing shell after shell. Each blast tore the ground apart. When the smoke cleared, the hillside was silent. No one was left to fight. The end of the empire. On July 2nd, the island of Okinawa was declared secure. But there was no celebration, only silence. The cost had been unimaginable. Over 12,000 Americans dead, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and tens of thousands of civilians lost. Connor climbed out of his tank and stood on a hill overlooking the sea. The sky was gray, the ocean calm again. Ships stretched to the horizon, a silent fleet waiting for the next order. Jenkins joined him, holding his helmet under one arm. "So that's it, huh?" Connor nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's it for here, but not for the war." He didn't know it yet. No one did. But in just a few weeks, a new weapon would end the war entirely. Not a tank, not a plane, but a bomb that could erase a city. Connor looked at his battered Sherman, the machine that had carried him through hell. "Guess even steel has its limits," he whispered.
The war was over. Not with the roar of guns, but with a single blinding light that erased 2 cities and ended millions of dreams. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The emperor's voice, calm, distant, almost divine, echoed across a broken nation. The soldiers laid down their weapons. The skies, for the first time in years, were quiet. The silence felt heavier than any explosion. Return of the Iron Beasts. Across the Pacific, on the islands once soaked in blood, the Shermans sat motionless. Engines cold, cannons silent. Some stood half buried in mud, others rested on beaches, rusting under tropical rain. For years, they had been the spearhead of a new kind of war, steel, fire, and fear. Now they were monuments to it. Sergeant Bill Connor stood before his tank one last time. The paint was scarred, the armor dented. Each mark told a story of Saipan, of Okinawa, of friends buried in shallow graves. He ran a hand over the steel. "She got us through," he murmured, "through everything." Private Jenkins stood beside him, arms crossed, silent. "What happens to her now?" he asked quietly. Connor smiled faintly. "They'll melt her down, I suppose. Turn her into cars, bridges, maybe even plows. She'll live on, just not like this." They stood there for a long moment, listening to the wind. No gunfire, no orders, just the waves breaking on the shore. The sound of peace and the ghosts it carried. The Fallen and the Forgotten. In Japan, Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato walked among ruins. Once proud cities were now skeletons of glass and ash. He carried no weapon, only a notebook and the memory of every man who had died under his command. He passed by a field where a Sherman lay destroyed, its turret blown open, its tracks twisted. Children played around it, climbing its steel carcass, laughing. Sato stopped and bowed his head. "Hisonai nai," he whispered. They were machines, but they outlived us all. He tore a page from his notebook and placed it on the tank's hull. The words, written in neat Japanese characters, read, "Steel does not hate, men do." Across the ocean. Back in America months later, the returning soldiers were greeted by cheers, flags, and music. But for many, the noise felt hollow. They had left pieces of themselves in the Pacific, in the jungles, in the mud, inside the iron beasts that saved their lives. Connor walked through a scrapyard in California where rows of Shermans waited to be dismantled. The smell of oil and rust filled the air. A worker shouted over the machinery, "You one of the boys who drove these things?" Connor nodded. The man smiled. "Hell of a machine, huh?" "Yeah," Connor said softly. "Hell of a war." He stopped before a tank stripped of its cannon, its engine gone. Only the shell remained, silent, but still powerful. He placed his hand on the cold metal one last time. "Rest easy, old girl. You did your job." Legacy. Years later, the world changed. The Sherman became a museum piece, a relic of a time when courage meant steel. Children climbed onto it, historians praised it, and veterans saluted it with trembling hands. But those who had fought beside it remembered something deeper: the smell of oil, the sound of rain on armor, the fear that lived in every heartbeat. The Sherman was not perfect. It was outgunned, outmatched at times, but it endured. It represented the spirit of men who refused to stop, even when the world seemed to collapse around them. And for those who faced it, the German pilots, the Japanese soldiers, it became the symbol of an unstoppable tide. Steel could not feel, but it carried the weight of every soul that fought within it. Epilogue. In a small museum decades later, an old Sherman sits beneath a quiet light. Its green paint is faded, its guns silent, but its presence commands respect. A little boy walks up and asks his grandfather, "Did you really drive one of these?" The old man, Bill Connor, hair white, hand shaking, smiles gently. "Yes," he says, "and she never let me down." The boy touches the cold steel, eyes wide. "Was it scary?" Connor looks at the tank for a long moment. Then he whispers, almost to himself, "It was war. Everything was scary. But inside her, we felt invincible." The boy nods slowly, not fully understanding. Connor smiles faintly. "Someday you will." Outside, the wind carries the faint echo of engines long gone, the ghosts of the Shermans rolling once more, through the pages of history, into eternity.